Welcome to our webinar on everything you need to know for your college journey. We've got a checklist for you. We're going to hit some high notes. My name is Aaron Golulmbfskie. I'm the Education Director here at Prep Matters.
And I am Maurice Jackson. I'm an education counselor at Matters.
And we are excited to share with you the checklist. So first of all, everyone here at this webinar will be receiving this lovely 2-page college journey checklist in your inbox. It covers everything you need to know from sophomore year through junior year, all the way up to saying yes in senior year. So it is way too much for us to cover in detail, but please rest assured that you will all have access to this. I believe you could also find most, if not all of this information on our website as well. But Maurice and I felt that instead of just reading this to you, it would probably be a little more handy if we go through and talk about the big picture decisions that you're going to face and your family's going to face over the next year or year and a half until we make that college decision. So let's dive in, shall we? And when I like to, this slide is probably the first one that we use for most of our talks, because really it's what colleges want. It's the reason that we're all here. Right. So this is some survey results brought to you by a group called NACAC, the National Association of College Admissions Counselors. And it basically asks colleges, in this case, about 220 of them, hey, what do you find valuable when you're screening your applicants? What are you looking for when you're accepting students? The highlighting here, by the way, the green and the red, that's mine. But it's probably no surprise to folks that the top three here, grades in all courses, grades in college prep courses, and strength of curriculum. Yeah, grades. That's a surprise to no one. The next on the list here is these test scores, SAT and ACT scores. And a sharp-eyed viewer might notice here that this is actually from 2018, 2019. This is pre-pandemic data. So as you know, there's been a bit of a change in how people view these tests and scores and college admissions really as a whole. So what does that same survey look like now? So this is actually the first year that they've done the survey since pre-pandemic. And as you would imagine, the top three are still grades, as it should be. Test scores, however, have now fallen a bit in the rankings, considerable importance. Not many schools willing to say they find them considerably important, but a vast majority of schools still find them of some sort of importance, moderate or limited. So what do you see here, Maurice, in these changing trends over the last 3 years?
I see emphasis on understanding who the student is, which I think is big. A lot of schools before the pandemic really weren't trying to understand the student's entire being. Yes, their narrative, but what this shows is that every other part of the student is being included in the conversation about whether or not that student's going to be a part of the incoming class.
Yeah, I think that makes a lot of sense. And I'm going to dive into the beginning of this presentation and talk about test scores, which now are like every other facet of the application, right? When parents ask me what to make of test optional, right, I usually tell them, well, college admission has always been AP optional and extracurricular optional and sports optional and internship optional, but it doesn't stop students from, trying to put their best foot forward. And if testing can be part of your putting your best foot forward as part of your application, well, then it'll help. However, if it's not, well, then you have the option to not include that testing. Because again, most schools are now what we call test optional. But I would say it behooves you probably to do a little more research there and understand the colleges on your list, right? Because most schools are test optional. However, I would say there's probably a range there. Some schools are absolutely 100% test optional, and they mean it and they believe it. Many schools were test optional before the pandemic. However, some schools, which looking at you, maybe Georgetown, right, have always loved testing, right? So they were test optional, but reluctantly so. In fact, schools like Georgetown and MIT here and a few others have gone back to requiring tests. However, a greater number of schools now are what we would call test blind or test free. And those schools, most notably probably the UC system here, those schools aren't going to look at scores even if you send them. In fact, you can't send them. They won't even let you. So those schools not even going to look at if you send them. And honestly, for me, I like that. I think because then you know where you stand, right? The test optional, there's a lot of gray area in between where I've put some quotes here, right? Where students won't be disadvantaged if they don't send scores, but good scores will be an advantage. And I just don't know how to square those circles. So it's tough to give advice. So I personally like it when colleges are really clear and say exactly what they want from students. So anything to add there, Maurice, before I dive into test minutia?
I mean, no, I think you're hitting it right on the head, right? So the clear wording is super helpful, but you can sort of navigate it. I think now that we are sort of at the end of test optional and sort of getting lay of the land, we'll see a lot of inflated numbers, and so that can cause panic. But it's easy to have those conversations and having those conversations early about testing to understand your test strategy, which we'll talk about a little bit later.
Yeah. So let's dive in. SAT versus ACT. So if testing is going to be part of your college application, the first decision you have to make is, do I take the SAT or do I take the ACT? And we here at Prep Matters strongly recommend you pick one rather than trying to take both, because honestly, you've got better things to do with your Saturday mornings than take every standardized test known to man, right? So most of us are familiar with the scoring. Most folks familiar with the very familiar 1600 SAT perfect score. The ACT is at a 36. And I can assure you that colleges really don't care which test you take, right? Because all they're going to do is they're going to take those scores and they're going to consult a concordance table that basically says, oh yeah, the 90th percentile score on this test is the same thing as the 90th percentile score on that test. And there's a little equating that colleges will use to consider all applicants on the same basis. So the best test is if there is a best test for you, right? Colleges really less concerned about this. So oftentimes people ask me what's a good score, and you might be thinking to yourself, oh, well, what can I get on the SAT or ACT? And I just want to kind of give everybody a reality check and remind you that the average SAT score by design is about 1,000. The average ACT score just actually took a hit. We're down to 19.5, I believe. It was 20 for a while. That was released, I think, in maybe last month. But anyway, yeah, so when I talk to students, Maurice, I don't know about you, what's a good ACT score? People usually start like, oh, maybe like a 33, I guess is okay. And it's easy to just, especially here in DC Metro, where everybody's above average, just to kind of lose a bit of a reality check and perspective on what these scores mean. So I just like to start out with that score distribution there. So keep that in mind. So which test is right for you? Let's actually look at the tests and see if you can decide which one might be better for your son or daughter or for you. So let's take a look at the structure and format of these things. The ACT, largely unchanged from its debut in literally the 1950s, still is a paper test and still consists of the same sections. English section followed by a math section. You get a little break. And then we have a reading comprehension section and the science test. There are a couple experimental questions at the end that really don't count or affect your score, but that's the paper ACT as it's been for many, many, many years. The new SAT and PSAT, for that matter, are digital, right? These are now computer tests, and they look really different. The reading and writing section, now the SAT lumps together all of the English grammar questions and the reading comprehension questions. 2 modules there, 27 questions each, about an hour. Then you get a 10-minute break and you basically do it again for math. So if we kind of add these things up and take a look at the tests as a whole, right, the paper ACT checks in at almost 3 hours long, 215 questions. The SAT, gosh, it's much closer to a 2-hour test and fewer than half the questions. So most students, when looking at this figure, are like, wow, the SAT seems like a better match. And I get that, and we're going to talk about why in a moment. But the one thing I would want everybody to take away from this is that both of these are really long tests, right? I mean, especially if you take the ACT, right? That's just it's quite an experience. It's a 3.5-hour extravaganza, right? When you get down to the starting and the bubbling in your name and your exam ticket number and the breaks and the getting started and the finishing up. Yeah, students arrive at the test center around 8 in the morning and usually leave around 1, honestly. So what I mean by this is I think that no matter which test you choose, SAT or ACT, realize that these are long tests, right? And the only way to practice is by taking long tests, right? So whether you choose a tutor or decide to take a class or self-prep, make taking full-length practice tests part of your preparation. Because I can tell you that the success on these tests is as much about knowing where to put the comma or what the equation of a circle is, as it is about staying cool and making good decisions over the course of a 3.5-hour test. So that is the take-home message here. But the SAT is a lot shorter. How do they pull off that trick? Well, they pull off this trick by being an adaptive test. So what that means, when students go take the ACT, yeah, there's one ACT that's given at a particular test date, and every student in the country takes the same test. No longer true about the SAT. The first reading module that students take and the first math module students take will be what we call a static module. It doesn't change. Right? It's consisting of easy, medium, and hard questions. The second module, however, will change. And it depends on the student's performance, of course, on that first module. If the first module goes really well, well, then the student will get the harder second module that consists of medium and hard questions. However, if the first module doesn't go very well, they're going to be stuck with an easier second module that honestly isn't going to let them get enough points to get a score that they're probably going to be pretty happy with. It's important for students to remember that the questions are not all quite weighted equally anymore. So important for students to understand the adaptive nature of this test so that they can put their best foot forward. What are the other considerations besides obviously, being paper versus digital? That's huge for kids. So I encourage all students, right? If you haven't checked out this digital SAT, you can download the Bluebook app from College Board. It's free. You can fire up some practice tests. Some students like the test on the screen better. Other students, not so much. So how do you know? You spend some time and you find out, right? Other important things here is that the SAT math section has integrated Desmos. If you love that and your school uses Desmos a lot, well, that might be a feature that you're really excited about. On the ACT, you're going to bring your trusty TI-85 or 84 or 83, so you do have a calculator nonetheless. Probably the most important consideration, though, when I think about SAT versus ACT is really this one, speed versus complexity, right? Most people who do this professionally would probably agree that the hardest stuff on the SAT is harder than the hardest stuff on the ACT. Students usually say, oh, because it's trickier. I don't like trickier, but I will say it's certainly more nuanced and it's more complex. That is for sure the case. But the ACT has way more questions in way less time. So which test is harder? That I can't answer. It just kind of depends on how your brain's wired, right? I've had some students who, brilliant kids, they just couldn't hang with the speed of the ACT. I've had other students who could hang with the speed of the ACT, but gosh, the really complicated prose on the SAT kind of befuddled them, right? Which is easier? Just kind of depends on how your brain's wired. So that's probably the first consideration. Other considerations is really, oftentimes people feel when they take the SAT like, oh gosh, it feels like they're messing with me here. And to an extent they are, right? The ACT for a long time marketed itself as the ACT assessment test. And the SAT for a long time marketed itself as the SAT reasoning test. And I loved those. I'm sad that they dropped those monikers because I think they were about as accurate descriptors of the test as they'd ever put on the names. Because really the ACT is more straightforward. Kids feel like it looks like things in school. Oh yeah, I was in school that day. I remember that thing. So I get the question right. The SAT kind of likes to put a little twist on things, right? Show you something that you haven't quite seen like that in school and make you think on your feet. Again, what's easier? Being able to do lots of perfect recall without mistakes or thinking deeply about fewer questions? I don't know. Depends on how your brain's wired, but those are the decisions that we have to make when we think about the SAT versus ACT. What jumps out for you, Maurice?
I mean, your last point about the way the two exams are so different, really stands out to me because I often have conversations with families about, which exam is better. And oftentimes, I can't really say which one is going to be better for your student. I think that you have to sort of go through the practice and understand which way your student's brain works to understand which exam would be best for the student. So I'm very happy that you shed some light on that because I know that people watching are going to be super elated about that information.
Okay, well, then they're going to be really excited about the next slide, Maurice, because I'm going to dive in just a little deeper in a subject by subject basis before we leave this topic of testing aside. So one other thing to think about is, well, what's on these tests, right? The content of them. So if I were to do a quick blow by blow, section by section, let's talk about the reading on both tests. The ACT has long reading passages, and perhaps long reading passages is a modern appellation for 90 lines of text, but it's got 90 lines of text. Right. If that's what long form reading is these days, I suppose it is. The SAT, however, honestly, no reading passage is longer than a paragraph. But there are a lot more reading passages that are paragraph long rather than few passages that are longer. Probably the other important difference is honestly the level of diction used in these passages are different. The reading level, or kind of the lexile score, if you're people who understand these things, right, radically different between the SAT and the ACT. The analogy I like to use that will land for parents and not for any students listening, right, is that the ACT is to the USA Today as the SAT is to the Journal. That's very different, and the tests do really feel that different in terms of the way they present information and the complexity and the nuance and the level of abstraction, if you will. So on the math side, however, we have another important difference, and that is that the SAT is very, very much a test of algebra. Algebra 1 and Algebra 2, highly drawn from. Those are the most important subjects for SAT math. ACT math, on the other hand, is a little more equitable in terms of drawing from all sorts of math classes. It'll draw from Algebra 1 and Algebra 2, but it also draws pretty heavily from geometry, and there's a lot of pre-calc there too, right? The ACT is basically a fairly broad, like, final exam in multiple choice form on the last 4 years of like your math education. SAT, a lot more targeted. So for students who haven't yet completed pre-calc, you might say, oh gosh, ACT, more pre-calc. And yeah, that would definitely be something you'd want to weigh in making that decision. There's more quote unquote advanced math and pre-calc on the ACT than there is on the SAT. That being said, there are ways you can teach yourself the few things from pre-calc that you do need to know. So it shouldn't be a deal breaker, but it should be something you think about. What you don't have to think about, honestly, is the English and writing sections, because they're honestly almost identical from each other. They're just grammar tests. They really are. And for most students who are willing to put in the time and work hard, whether you take the SAT or the ACT, the English or writing section, the grammar section, tends to be the easiest one to improve because it's the most consistent test to test. We can just drill it and kill it, run all the grammar rules, and life looks good. So that's really not going to help you make the decision. The last one that I do want to talk about is the science section, right? Because people feel strongly about that. Ooh, I like science. I should take the ACT. Or, oh no, I hate science class. I'm never taking the ACT. In as much as I've just told you that the ACT is the more straightforward test, and it is, the least straightforward thing they've ever done is to probably call the science section, right? Trust me, I'm a pretty big science dork, and this isn't science, right? If you're being honest about it, this is the reading charts and graphs section, right? Because that's what it is. Just like the reading section, right, does not ask students random questions about The Great Gatsby and The Grapes of Wrath and all those books they were supposed to have read because it's a standardized test and they can't. Well, in exactly the same way, they can't ask students random questions about bio or chem or physics because they don't even know who's taken what class yet. So again, it's going to be more about information retrieval. So in many cases, student science scores actually are more highly correlated with their reading score than with their math score, which is a surprise to many parents. But when you think about it, the task of understanding an experiment and answering questions versus understanding a passage and answering questions, well, it's really about information retrieval and processing and speed, and it's very much the same set of skills. So I don't want any science-phobic students out there crossing the ACT off their list, and I don't want all of my fellow science nerds out there saying, saying, oh yeah, ACT, we're all in, because that's a little bit like the tail wagging the dog there. So don't let that science thing change your mind. So those have all been broad recommendations. There aren't that many kids for whom I can say, yes, you're absolutely SAT or ACT. However, as a rule, students who have extra time accommodations, just start with the ACT. Trust me. I've been doing this for a long time, and I can think of, gosh, over the last 20 years of doing this, maybe one handful of kids in that time who had accommodations on both tests and for whom the SAT was actually the better fit. It almost never happens. I'm not saying it's impossible, but it's kind of a unicorn situation. So if you do have accommodations, extra time is just more handy on the ACT than it is on the SAT. The SAT already gives you a lot of time. Extra time on the ACT is having more time to sit there and not understand that thing you just read. Extra time on the ACT lets you finish the test, right? And in addition to extended time, pardon me, the ACT also offers a much broader suite of potential accommodations for students. There's more multi-day testing options. There's more different time length and stop the clock and a broader suite of accommodations. And the ACT tends to be a little easier to deal with in terms of accommodations. So if that is you, start with the ACT. There might be a reason to switch, but probably not. I see you nodding, Maurice. You agree?
Yes, in the past, I've dealt with accommodations for testing, and I can agree with everything you said. I think that extended time and all those things, it's important to get that information early and get those accommodations early for testing, and then figuring out which exam is best for you.
Yeah. The ACT, especially recently, especially if you're a public school student, because if you've got anything that's on an IEP or a 504 that says extended time, they're going to rubber stamp that now. If you're an independent school student, then you don't have a 504 or an IEP, obviously. So that might take a little more time for you. But they've been working very hard, both organizations, to streamline those processes. So final note on testing: when should you test? When should you get started? And again, Aaron will give you no right answers, but he will give you options and he will give you questions to think about, because we hear all of the time. And so, by the way, when is the test? So there we go. There are 7 ACTs a year. There are a bunch of SATs a year. They're scattered throughout the school year and even the summer. Don't forget the PSAT happens in October, and we've got some APs over the first 2 weeks of May. But that's essentially the calendar that we have. So I hear all of the time from students, and I'm sure you do as well, Maurice. Oh yeah, I hear we should definitely take the October test, right? Because that's just last ditch seniors who want to take one last swing at the test, and they're not very smart, so it's easier to do better than them. Or and please just don't listen to any of this stuff. It's garbage, right? That is not how the test works. It's not how the test is scored. It's not how it's scaled. There is no easy or harder test based on the calendar. However, there very well may be easier or harder test dates for you to be prepared and be your best self, right? So think about your calendar, right? Are you playing a sport, right? Are you in the fall musical? Are you in the spring musical? Are you taking AP exams? Are you not taking AP exams? You know, if you're, I don't know, gunning to be a state champion wrestler this year, and you know that you're going to be 20 pounds less than your ideal weight in February, that is not a really good time to take an ACT, because you can't even think straight, right? So consider your calendar, right? There are lots of reasonable ways to do this thing, right? In fact, we have every year what I would say are the high achieving students who are looking to prep in the summer and take advantage of the summer between sophomore and junior year, come out of the gates hard, hit an SAT or ACT really early in junior year, and try to be done before holiday break. And that's a reasonable plan if you've got, if you've got the maturity to handle that, if you've got the time in the summer to handle that, and especially if you've taken pre-calculus already. That helps a lot if you're up on a math track. However, that's not right for everybody. There are people who haven't started yet, and that's fine. There are people who wait for the ACT, see what happens, and then maybe decide they're going to start prepping in the fall and make a run up at a late winter and spring ACT. That's okay too. Maybe you don't want to start prep in the middle of 2-a-day football practices in the late summer. I don't blame you. I wouldn't either. Or we push off and we try to target the new March SAT, and we'll start our prep in the new year in January. That's okay too. Or we'll wait until we've taken more pre-calculus and we'll target some summer tests, right? Maybe junior year grades are something that you need to focus on because your transcript isn't where it needs to be, and that's the priority for you. And then you're going to put off testing until the summer after junior year, and you're going to work really hard at it then. There's no one right answer here. So really, the best time to test is the best time for you to test. So let's take a moment before we hand things over to Maurice for a minute and talk about stress and anxiety. A topic that's near and dear to all of our hearts, for sure. Because when I think of what I try to do for kids, and parents often ask me what they can try to do for their kids during this test prep process. I think Ned's answer, Ned Johnson, the guy who runs this place, his answer is always, right, be a calming presence, right? Be a non-anxious presence in your student's life. Because what we're really trying to do is we're trying to get them to perform at peak performance, right? And if we think about performance versus stress, it actually looks like this, right? What does no stress look like? Zero stress on the SAT is like, I'm going to make smiley faces out of the bubbles, right? Zero stress is, I don't care. We don't want that. We also don't want students to be overly stressed. We want them kind of focused and engaged, working at their peak performance level. So not all stress is bad, but too much stress is actually horrible, as we know. Everybody knows the word distress, but actually few people know the word eustress. So if students aren't engaged in this process, maybe they kind of just haven't recognized how important it is yet, and that happens. Students have a wide range of kind of stress response curves here, but everybody works better when they can be calm. So really think about that when you're doing your test prep. When do I have time to approach this in a calm and reasonable manner? And that, more than anything else, I think, will lead to some positive results. So, Maurice, are we ready to dive in with
I'm ready,
some talk about junior year, not test prep, but college planning?
Yes. So the big question now is, where do you begin, right? So the first step is having an honest conversation, an early conversation between the family and the college counselor, right? And so you really want to lay everything on the table. When I say that, I'm saying, you really want to talk through what things you want out of the entire process. So let's say that your student wants Tulane. So start talking about Tulane as an option on the table, as a first choice. Maybe your student doesn't know what school they want, but they know they maybe want to be in a rural setting, a smaller school. So really having those conversations early. And I say that because things change, right? You're having this conversation with the junior, and by the end of the summer, they may say, you know what, actually, I want a big school. So laying the things out on the table and really getting a lay of the land and what things are going to be expected is super, super important. And by the end of this conversation, you should really leave with a clear understanding of all the things that are going to be coming over the next year and a half. And so I would say the process is going to be big. It is, right? And if you left that meeting saying, we got a lot of things to talk through, then you had a great conversation, right? Because the process to getting into college is not a small one, right? There are a ton of moving parts to the process, right? So you can say grades, you can say activities, you can say any of those things, whether it's testing or visits, interviews, all of those things take part in this process. And so if you're having the conversation early, you can kind of get a lay of the land and start to plan the steps so that way you can have a fruitful experience throughout the process.
I'm curious, Maurice, when you meet with families, do we meet families as a whole? Do we meet with students and parents separately? What do you think works best?
When I start with the process, I like to meet with everyone, right? Because I want to understand what the parents are thinking about the process and also understand some of their anxieties around the process. I also want to understand what the student wants. The experience is always going to be student-centered, and I want their voice to be a large part of the conversation. And while I want to know what the parents want to think and feel, I really want to focus a lot of that energy on unpacking what things are super central to the student's experience and what they're hoping to get out of the experience.
That sounds great.
Usually, again, it's all of us there, but we let the student lead for sure.
Great. All right. Well, I'm eager to hear more about these different stepping stones.
Yeah, I'm happy to tell. All right. So grades and rigor, right? This is the conversation that I have right off the bat, right? Everyone wants to say, hey, look at my transcript and like tell me about this. So the first thing is, does freshman year grades really matter, right? So I think about the transcript as a pyramid, right? So that strong base, that's your freshman year. So you start strong, you give yourself a really solid base, right? Because everything is up from there. So really, so I would say yes, the freshman year grades matter because that's where your journey, your academic journey is going to start, and that's where admissions will read. Do senior grades matter? Yes and no, right? And hear me out, because you are going to be applying to college with everything from ninth to 11th, right? So that is what schools are going to see when they get that first application. However, they will see the class that you're taking as a senior. And what they want to know is that, are you maintaining rigor? Are you still maintaining academic momentum? So yes, they do matter, and they still want to see what you're taking, but those are not going to get you, those are not the grades that are going to get you into college, right? So I hear a lot of times families say, well, we had a really solid junior year and we're going to get that last bump in senior year. It's not really the way it works. So I'm happy that we have this here so I can explain that. It's not really the way it works.
So the last bump is junior year then?
Yes, the last bump is junior year because senior year is really sort of the cherry on top. What did you do? Did you keep it going, right? So I know that senior burnout at the end and say, I'm going to drop a class, not always the best idea. And I would say if that's something, if you're thinking about switching courses halfway through the year, really have a conversation with your entire family, with the student, and with the counselor at school. Other things, how important is GPA? Well, GPA is important, right? Because schools are looking at you as that sort of number. They want to understand what grades you did, what grades you earned, and how well you did, right? So I often see families put forward the weighted versus the unweighted, right? Those things matter in context of high school, but really for admissions, they won't matter because they'll sort of wipe the slate clean and create their own system to evaluate.
Right. Don't most colleges recalculate your GPA in
They
some way?
absolutely do. They will recalculate it. So don't worry if you're putting forward that weighted or unweighted, they're going to recalculate. So that's important to understand. So then the other part is, what's better, the grades or the rigor? Well, feels like a double-edged sword, right? Because yes, you do want to take academically rigorous courses, but you also want to do well in them, right? So let's say you're taking the highest level of math and sciences that's offered at your school, but you're not doing well. That does not shed light on you positively, right? So you want to make sure that you're doing well in the grades in the classes, that you are taking. So maybe you're not a student that's gonna take the highest science course, that AP Chem or something like that, but you decide, I'm gonna take the environmental science. And you do really well. It's better to show that you can do really well versus taking all of the harder courses and not managing them well.
Yeah. That I think leads into our next topic well, because another area that students seem to think they can do it all are also, right, activities.
Yes,
I have seen that, I know.
I have seen so many kids want to do it all, every single activity, all the time, everything, everywhere, all at once, right? And I think.
And do we think that's a good idea?
I think it's good in theory. I do. But is it good in practice? No, right? Because ultimately, your application should have a through line, right? So what things have you done? And what things have you done that meant the most to you? What things have you done that meant the most to you that you've continued with? And what do those things say about you, about the community that you're working with, whether that's your school community or your home community or any other community that you belong to, right? The through line should be that you are putting forward energy and time into things that matter the most to you rather than dabbling in here and there and everywhere, because really it shows that you aren't really putting a ton of energy and focus into things and seeing them through over time, right? So that says a lot about the student. So I'd say instead of doing 20 different things, it's okay to have 5 or 6 strong things, really focusing your energy and reevaluating what things add to your story and what things matter most. And again, if you are a science kid and you've always been a science kid, be a science kid, do all the science camps and things like that. Those help with your narrative. And they show admissions, hey, this kid loves this thing. And there's a through line through their application.
I always tell students, lean into what makes you, right? Like
exactly.
Yeah. And I think I've often heard the language of, right, colleges are no longer looking for well-rounded students, right? They're looking for well-rounded classes full of very spiky students, right? Who have delved very deeply into the things that make them interesting. And you know, that's where the well-rounded class comes from, not from a whole bunch of well-rounded students.
And that's something that I think holds a little bit of weight, right? And I know that every student is not going to be the kid that knows they want to do science and
Mhm.
knows they want to do math. That makes sense. Again, they're high school kids, right? But again, investing time and energy into things that feel good, that you like, and those things don't necessarily have to be STEM related or humanities related. They can be, you really enjoy advocacy work, and so that's something that you lead with. All those things really do help with the narrative and help with admissions creating that well-rounded freshman class.
Okay, so we've talked about grades. We've got a transcript under control. We've pruned our extracurricular activities to just the ones we want to.
Mhm.
What's next?
College visits. This is my favorite, right? Because I often say, actually, I always say in my meetings with families, it's important for students to envision themselves in spaces to know that they want to be there, right? And so, really, that means, if you say you want to go to Villanova, well, let's get you in that space and help you feel the energy there and see the buildings there. So that way, when you've seen it there, you can say, hey, I could be here for 4 years. So when do students do it, right? Breaks are great, a great time to go visit school. So the fall break, spring break, I have a lot of families that will really target areas to see certain schools all at once, but also during any large holidays. So there's an extended weekend. Definitely seeing if you can hop on the road and go see a school that's an hour or two away. I always tell families, start close. If there's a school that you can walk to, or it's in the city that you're in, see those, and then sort of work your way out. But also just being curious. So thinking again about where, cast your net far and wide, and allow yourself to maybe say, I said that I wanted a big school, but maybe let's see this small school that's close by, right? Because it's important to understand that there are different experiences. And again, that's why I say start early, because things change. Because I've had kids say, I really want this big school. And then they did exactly that. They cast that net far and wide and they saw a medium-sized school or a small school. And they said, hey, actually, I could probably do this 2,000 person experience because it kind of feels great. And so allowing, again, yourself to be curious. But you can do this really a ton of ways, right? So you can schedule tours or info sessions and do interviews. You can sit down in classes. But really, the most important thing I would say is to take notes, write down what things are important, what things stick out, because it's going to be super helpful as you continue through the process and you start to build out that list, right? Because your list will vary a little bit. But again, if you know the things that stand out and matter the most to you, you'll end up with a list of schools that match those things.
Yeah. And if I were to reiterate anything there, it would certainly be the notes, because often I talk to students after they come back from one of those whirlwind, I just saw 8 schools in 5 days over spring break kind of journeys. And I'm like, so what did you like? And what did you not like? And they'll start telling me about this thing they liked at one school. And halfway through, they're like, wait, no, I think that was at a different school. Right. And it's really hard to keep all of that straight, especially when you're planning these whirlwind trips. So a lot of like, let's go to the car and do like 10 minutes of family journaling about what we thought about this school. It seems silly, but oh my goodness, it's a really good idea just to keep everything straight, because it can be pretty overwhelming for lots of students.
It can be.
Okay. So we now visited some colleges. I guess we should put some on a list, huh?
Yes. Building the list, right? This is one of the things that ends up being really anxiety inducing, right? But again, so let's think about those notes that you took, right? What things stood out? What things were important? Again, you know the things that you want. Did the schools that you see align with all of those, right? Were there things that maybe you said absolutely not? Were there things that like you could sort of negotiate, right? What things were really important? So then also thinking about the fit check, right? So were there schools that like, you wanted to be in the city and you saw some suburban schools and that just didn't cut it, right? Thinking about all the things that matter most. So that way you can have a list that aligns with all of the things that you really want, whether it's a major, whether it's a study abroad program, all of those things. And then the final part, right? And this part kind of is one
This is
of
where
the
we get in trouble, or I think.
exactly where we get in trouble, right? A balance. I am always sort of going to encourage students to shoot for the stars. I think it's important to have a solid number of reaches. However, I will also say it's really important to have a balanced list, right? So thinking about having a good number of targets and a good number of likelies, right? You don't want to have a sort of inverted triangle, if you will, where you're top heavy, where you have 6 or 7 or 8 reach schools and maybe only one. The goal here about this experience really is maximizing your outcomes, right? And so when you have a top heavy list, you don't give yourself the opportunity to have some of those rewards throughout the process, i.e. getting some of those acceptances, right? And I know, and I've had this conversation, Aaron, so many times with families, well, it's a reach, so maybe we'll just apply to all the reaches. And, if we apply to all of them, then we'll increase our chances of getting in.
Yeah, and it's a
That
shame,
makes
right?
sense.
Because especially if you look at the numbers of the data out of the Common App, at the numbers of colleges that students have been applying to over the last decade, it's just ratcheting up and up and up, right? And students are applying to more and more colleges, so that means students are being rejected by more and more colleges, and admissions percentages are going down, and it looks rough out there. And a lot of the reason is students are just applying to a lot of schools, sometimes wisely and sometimes less so.
Yeah, absolutely. And again, I think sometimes it goes to remembering the fit. Yeah, maybe you are a perfect fit for Penn.
Yeah.
Maybe you aren't. And so remembering what things matter and if the school fits with the things that you want.
Yeah. So having some sort of list towards the end of junior year seems good. And probably the last thing to remember for junior year planning, I suppose, is
the letters of recommendation, right? Those are going to be super important, right? Because those people who are going to be writing your letter of recommendation, 2 of your teachers, STEM or humanities, are going to give admissions a picture of who you are inside the classroom. So it adds flavor or context to your transcripts. So they really will write a narrative and a story about how you learn, how you interact with your peers. So asking for those early in that junior year, around that second semester, is super helpful. Typically, you're going to only need 2 from your teachers. And I'll explain a little bit, but you're typically going to need 2 from your teachers. Now, there may be other circumstances like a studio art program or an engineering program where you'll need an additional one, but those are case by case basis. And so typically, again, you will only need 2. Now, 2 of those, again, are your teachers. 1 is going to be from your counselor. So that is a total of 3. But the counselor has to write, your in-school counselor has to write 1 for everyone. So I just want to be clear, it doesn't really count towards the 2. That is one you will always get no matter what, and you won't have to go ask for that. Yeah. So again, asking for those letters of recommendation early and asking people that you've had positive in-class experiences with, because those are going to be the people that will write positively about you. And you really do want to start with those teachers in junior year. If you aren't able to get some from junior year, you're able to reach back a little bit, but I would say maybe not reaching back to 9th grade because that's a little bit far away. So really honing in on your energy on those junior year teachers.
And I think really being proactive about it, right? So many students, when I talk to, I'll ask about, well, what are you thinking for letters? And they'll say, well, I'm waiting to see how well I do in the classes. It's like, no, that's not how that works. You don't wait to see if you get an A and then ask for a letter, right? You say, this is a class I'm really excited about. I'm going to be engaged in it. I'm going to plan to ask for this letter because I'm going to be super engaged all year long. So I think it really starts with the, starting now and deciding where those letters are going to come from and then acting appropriately throughout the year rather than, hoping you get an A and then asking for a letter.
Yeah. Well, also too, if it's a teacher that a lot of students love, then
it's
too late. They could end up already having 15, which could be their cap. So it's really important that you ask early. Yeah.
I got ahead of myself, Maurice. So so I guess we're going to transition from kind of junior year into the summer now, right? And the main task of the summer between junior and senior year tends to be
the essay. Now, I know you probably heard the excitement in my voice when I said, go ahead, right? The essay is my favorite sort of part about this, right? Because it is the window into the student. So when you get to that sort of summer or middle part of the junior year, you start to think about the essay, what I would say is look at those Common App essay prompts and really brainstorm around those. And thinking about which sort of experiences you can talk about that align with questions.
Remind me, when are those released, Maurice?
So those actually are available throughout the year, but the application opens up August 1. But you
Okay,
can
so we can start
actually
thinking
look at
about those first.
yeah, so you can actually absolutely start brainstorming those questions uh, middle of the junior year, and really starting to think about what the story is you want to write, right? Because your essay will likely not just be written in one sit, right? I've never actually seen a student just write their essay and it's like, it's done. It's going to take a lot of time. So really allowing yourself time to brainstorm early so that way you can write, get eyes on it, rewrite, and then often produce your second draft and your third draft because that first draft is not going to be the one, and that's okay. Really, you're wanting to spend most of that summer working towards getting towards your final draft by the end of the summer. So
Okay.
thinking a little bit about just how it's used, right? Again, if it's a window, so admissions is going to use it as a window into the student. So yeah. So they want to gauge their ability to write complexly, but also just to convey a story and understand how you are thinking as a student. And again, we talked about this a little bit a while ago, right? How you add to the community. So that's a tool that they use it for. So when you start to write the essay, Aaron, this is, again, the essay is my jam. I love it. But when students are writing the essay, it's really, really important that their voice is at the forefront, right? I know that stories can sometimes feel like maybe they are so central to another person. That's maybe not the right story. The story has to be about you. It has to have your voice at the forefront. It has to showcase your ability to write well and to think well and to show how you understand and unpack complex ideas or how you understand the world around you and your personal experiences. Because again, it is about you and should really highlight who you are. But there also are some things that maybe you should avoid, right? So I know that it is pretty easy to say, hey, my story is all the things that I've done, right? And I think that that's important. All things you have done are super important to your application and will add to your narrative, but they're going to be on the activities list or your resume. So your essay should not be a copy of that. I would also say it's important to avoid certain topics. So like loss, death or divorce, injury, the service abroad one is a tricky one. I know that a ton of kids do service trips over the summer. You know, you go to the DR somewhere and you do a service trip and you come back and this is the moment that has changed my entire life. And maybe it has, right? I think that there's some importance to that, but that story has been done so many times. I don't think it's fresh anymore, and I don't think admissions will see it as fresh anymore. But also sort of the big game, the big shot, the big loss, those stories have been done for years. And so I don't think that those are fresh ideas either. And then dealing with learning differences, right? I understand that that is something that for a lot of students and families is important to give sort of a story to, right? And the good thing is that for the Common App, there's a section where you can explain it a little bit, but I don't think it should be the full story, right? Because I think it ends up sort of giving a student a very specific narrative versus allowing them to have a story with a small part added to it.
Yeah.
I would say in all, the one thing that I tell students, and this has been the thing that I've led with this entire year, is that when you write your essay, just be mindful that you're tying all of the loose ends together. And so that way, if I'm reading the essay, I shouldn't say, what does this thing mean? Or what do you mean by that? Really, the only question that admissions should walk away with from your essay is, do I want to learn more about the student?
Love that. Yeah, if I were to give advice to any students, I tell them, right, your essay should not be able to be written by anyone but you. Right. You know, a lot of students can write the essay about the service abroad trip or the sports injury. Like I want something that only you could have written. Right. I think that's what I don't know, makes me excited about reading a student's essay.
Yeah, you're hitting it on the head, Aaron.
Yeah. You know, and the essay, in fact, is all about you. And it's easy, I think, in this whole college admissions process to kind of to have it be all about you, but it's also kind of about the colleges, right, Maurice?
Yeah. So the other part, demonstrated interest. I love this because I think it's sort of the like hidden gem that a lot of schools don't really talk about, but is important, right? So demonstrated interest really for schools means that you are likely to enroll. So if you have an opportunity to demonstrate interest, please do it. So thinking about If the school is coming to visit your high school, definitely going, asking questions, sending follow-up emails. If there are virtual tour options, virtual info session options, attending those. And also, I'll make a note really quickly, using the same email address across all of those experiences, because that ends up being your ID, if you will. That's how those schools are going to track you. So I'd say use that email address that you signed up for the virtual tour with, that you did the actual campus tour with, that you did any correspondence with, as the email that you applied with. That's what they're going to track you with. So a great example of this is Tulane. I think we all know this. Tulane prioritizes demonstrated interest. And so they will definitely track that email. And the best way to really demonstrate your interest is applying early decision, right? Because the school really wants to know that you are for them and that if they say yes, you will come, because that is allowing them to yield.
Awesome. Thank you. Well, let's give Maurice a break a little bit and turn back to testing for a hot second. He's been doing a lot of talking. So now that we're in kind of talking about the summer between junior senior year, or start getting ready to start senior year, you might ask yourself, do I want to retest? How are my scores? Maybe I fell in love with a new school that feels a little more strongly about testing than something else is on my list, or maybe, hey, I just think I could do better. And I think I'll default to that last question a lot. So there's a flow chart here that I'm not going to go through all of it. Feel free to look as I talk. But I think what's most important here is, do we have a reasonable chance of doing something better, right? And a lot of that really depends on the student, right? If students have some time and energy to prepare, great. Or if junior year was just so stressful for you that maybe having the space to breathe a little bit over the summer, getting, I don't know, crazy idea, 8.5 or 9 hours of sleep at night, for a week or two before the test, maybe that could be helpful, right? So there are some intangibles that make, well, let me try again in August or September at the end of the summer, or right at the beginning of senior year, when you can just have space for it and you're not stressed about APs and you're not stressed about junior year grades. And hopefully, at this point, maybe you'll have your essay already written, and then you can just take another swing at the pitch in a very kind of relaxed way. That's where I tend to see good results happen. Students who get themselves twisted up and, oh no, I need another 150 points so I can apply to X school. That is not an awesome place to be, and not a great reason to retest, right? Just because you need another 150 points doesn't mean you're likely to get them, right? So be reasonable about it. But I've seen some really nice things happen because really, as we approach, senior year, you're really looking at your last chances to take the test, right? And those typically are the September and October tests, August and October for SAT, September and October for ACT, because after that, we are going to miss certainly some early decision deadlines about score reporting. So these tend to be students' last times. It's possible to certainly make the most of it. And again, think about your kid, right? I certainly have met some, late blooming students, will say, and just honestly, another 6 months of maturity, right? That prefrontal cortex is ripening at a rate in teenagers faster than any other points in their lives, right? So 6 months might not seem like a big deal, but it can be a really meaningful difference in terms of students' abilities to do all of those things I said were important, right? To stay cool and collected and make good decisions. That's all executive functioning. That's all prefrontal cortex. So for a late bloomer, a late retest is maybe a good idea. With that, we'll hand it back to Maurice for putting the final pieces together in senior year in the fall.
Yeah, so as soon as we hit that fall, right, that September, we are really thinking about the application strategy, right? And well, a couple other parts, but let's start with the application strategy. Because again, I said it earlier and I'll say it again, our goal is producing a higher yield, right? So thinking about, are there going to be schools that you apply early decision to, so that binding contract? But are there schools on your list that offer early action? And then thinking about even early decision 2 and regular decision. And so it's important to understand that everyone's strategy is going to be different. Yes, a lot of students do apply early decision. And yes, most schools do pull a good percentage of their incoming class from the students that apply early decision. And also that pool is more competitive. However, it's not right for everyone. And so it's important to talk as a family what that binding commitment will look like, and if it is right for you, but also if it's right for the student. Because a lot of students just say, hey, I know that I like this school, but I also know that I like these 3 other schools as well, and I'd be happy at any of them. And so I don't want to sort of bind myself to this one place because I could easily go to another place. So it's
Now,
important to
just
have,
as a gut check for me, like what percentage of students usually ED somewhere, would you say?
I would say typically for students that I'm working with,
Yeah, for our students.
really about 90% of our students. A lot of
Okay,
us
so
are
a lot of
applying,
students are taking advantage of that.
a lot of students are. But for that 10%, it's a
Sure,
matter
yeah.
of it's a matter of just sometimes it's just not the right decision. Sometimes they just don't have a school that they love enough to
Mhm.
ED. But a good portion of the students that we work with do apply early decision.
Okay, that's helpful to
Most
know.
of those kids will oftentimes have early action schools as well.
Mhm.
The other part, though, is those supplemental essays, right? So we've gotten a handle on that main essay, but now each school can have 2 or 3 supplemental essays ranging from 50 characters to 500 words. So it's important that as you think about your application strategy and the deadlines, you're also thinking about the writing piece and what writing you have ahead of you. And also starting the writing early because most supplemental essays will require a bit of research, a bit of poking around on the school's website. Now, so like if a school says, well, why us? Yes, you can say, I love the campus and I love the energy, but really, they are really hoping that you can dig deep. If you say you want to study chemistry, are you highlighting professors? Are you highlighting courses? Are you highlighting opportunities to specific to those majors? Really showing that you know the school and know the things that you say you are passionate about, besides just saying, I love the campus. But also, there are some sort of school specific questions, supplemental questions that can pop up. So, like, defend an unpopular opinion you hold. Any of those really will take a little bit of time and a little bit of writing and revision and writing and revision. So, it's important that you start early with those. But then additional essays. So, we talked about this a little bit a while ago, but again, that opportunity to add context and flavor to your application and explain anything that may have happened. It's important to write that early as well and allow yourself some time to really fully think about what it is that you want to include in that section and always running it through with your counselor, because sometimes you may think it's super important to add, but it may not really add to your application in a way that you would want it to.
I'm guessing it is not the case that 90% of students are writing additional essays.
It is not. It is not. I see so few of those. And
Okay, great. That's
really,
what I was thinking. I just wanted to be clear. Awesome.
I mean,
So
maybe 2 or 3 a year. And typically students will bring those to me. And I'm like, I think that this doesn't really count, but I appreciate that you want to share it. Maybe we can add it to a supplemental essay.
got it. All right. Well, it's time to do the exciting part, Maurice.
Yeah, crossing the finish line. So you're there. You've read over all the instructions, right? Review that application one more time. I know that it's easy, like you're ready to click and click and click, right? But give yourself some leeway, a week or maybe even 2, and read over that comment, the one part that gets sent to every school. But then also read over all the things you've copied and pasted in there. Read over the actual school application. Check with your counselor. See if all of your moving parts, so your letters of recommendation, your transcript, your school profile, all those things are ready to send. If you are submitting scores, you're submitting all your scores, you're trying to super score, ensure that you've either self-reported in the application, but you've covered on the other end and you've had them sent before you submit the application, because your school may use Naviance or Score, and those things typically are delivered instantly. But when you ask your scores to be sent to certain schools, those take a couple days. So again, giving yourself some leeway, some lead time to really go over all the moving parts, so that way you can hit that submit button.
Oh God, it's going to feel so good when you get there,
It
right?
is.
It's going
Yeah.
to feel wonderful. Well, it's felt wonderful to share all of this with you all today. We hope you've learned some things, and I hope really that you've got questions, because the whole point of this was to help you guys be able to ask yourselves the right questions, because again, the questions are all the same for most students, but the answers are very different. You're going to be the primary driver in finding them. We at Prep Matters, Maurice, myself, and others are always happy to help you on that journey. So please look us up if you've got any questions or anything we can do for y'all.